So it is my pleasure to bring this speaker to you as part of our NIH RISE grant and finding an opening on a Friday in between the various President's Lecture Series was good timing for everybody around. And I want to introduce to you Fred Corey. That's his slide up there, so I don't actually have to say what his talk is, but I can read it here. Protection of Tribal Cultural Practices through the Development of Native American Exposure Pathways, a summary of the Maine Tribal Exposure Pathway Project. Fred's been with the Micmac tribe in northern Maine since 1996, where he set up the Micmac Environmental Lab. So he and I are sort of kindred spirits since I helped set up the SKC Environmental Lab here, which has morphed into just a student research lab instead of a service lab, so we've kind of flipped over to the other side. But his is still a service lab serving not only the Micmac tribe, but I think the other tribes in Maine as well, as being the only native-owned certified drinking water lab in Maine. He's been quite active within the EPA, and I meet him at some EPA meetings from time to time. When I go to EPA meetings, he goes to a lot more than I do. But he's active on the Tribal Pesticide Program Council and the National Tribal Toxics Council. And over the last 3 years, since, as many of you may have known about the IMBRI program, that we're very involved with Montana State IMBRI program that funds stuff at all the tribal colleges and all the other university and colleges in the state, used to have as their PI Tim Ford, who left. And where did he end up? He ended up going to Maine. And after his extensive work with the Crow tribe, once he got there, I said, well, maybe there's something that we can do also to be involved with some of the tribes in Maine, because there are no tribal colleges east of Michigan. And that sort of started a process that introduced me to Fred, and over years, and a couple of years now, we've developed a few research projects that haven't actually gotten off the ground, but this year we are. We have something that we're going to go take tribal college students and some other people from the community here and some other faculty and help set up a community-based environmental health research project in the Micmac reservation this year. So it's really nice that he had time to come over here and talk a little bit about environmental health issues on tribal land on the other side of the country. I mean, we know a little bit about gold mining on the Fort Belknap Reservation and other issues here, coal burning on the east side of the state. We really don't know what's or east side of the state, we don't really know what's going on in the east side of the country. So it's really my pleasure to introduce Fred Corey. Thanks, Fred.
Thank you, Doug. Good afternoon, everyone. Yesterday I traveled from Presque Isle, Maine to this area, and actually today I feel a little bit disheveled because although I arrived a few minutes early, my luggage has not yet arrived, and I'm hoping it'll catch up with me before I head back to Maine. Otherwise, I may get home and still not have any luggage. But I'm very happy to be here today, and today I'm going to talk about a project that was kind of a long time in the making, actually. I think it took probably from its conception to completion almost close to a decade, all the way from the early 2000s until just a couple of years ago it was finally completed. So to start off, as an overview, I'm going to describe a little bit about Maine tribal demographics, just to give you a flavor of the tribal situation in Maine. I'll describe how and why we began the project. I'll describe the process that we used, some of the benefits of the exposure scenarios approach, and also results of the project. There are 5 federally recognized tribes in Maine, and there are 6,000 plus enrolled tribal members. Total tribal land holdings in Maine are over 285,000 acres of land, and those land holdings really represent all major ecosystem types in the state, including wetlands and uplands, farmland, developed properties, and aquatic resources of every type within the state. Getting to the problem statement in terms of why we had to do this project, really part of the problem lies in our political and jurisdictional environment in Maine with regard to tribes, and then there's a technical side to our issues. Regarding the political and jurisdictional side, back in 1980, there was a federal statute, the Indian Land Claim Settlement Act, that provided federal recognition to the tribes in Maine, but it also was kind of ambiguous with regard to the regulation of environmental and natural resources on tribal lands. Some of that ambiguity is because some of the jurisdiction was ceded to the state of Maine while the tribe retained some jurisdiction. It's created a source of concern and issues over the years. Notably, that the tribes have always been concerned that the state of Maine isn't looking out for its best interests, and there's a strong industrial lobby in Maine, primarily from the pulp and paper industry, that's really kind of steered the state to go in the direction it has gone with regard to environmental regulations. Back in the early 2000s, the state of Maine made it known that they intended to apply for EPA authorization to run the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System in Maine, and that's the system that's responsible for writing permits for wastewater discharges to water bodies in the state. Before the early 2000s, that was something that EPA managed, and the tribes felt that as a federal trustee for tribal resources, EPA has an obligation to carefully monitor their permits and make sure that tribal resources are not impacted. But again, as Maine was seeking to take that program over, the states or the tribes were really concerned that Maine would not have tribal interests in mind. And many different tribal cultural practices in Maine are linked to water resources, and that includes food and medicine, spiritual use, recreational use, and protection of water resources is really necessary to protect the health of the tribe and the cultural health of the tribe. So EPA came forward and recognized the tribal concerns and offered to provide some funding to the tribes to start to develop some of the exposure scenarios or tribal cultural practices that EPA could use to determine whether provisions of the Clean Water Act are being implemented according to the law. So what we ended up with was a direct implementation tribal cooperative agreement between EPA and the Maine tribes. This is really a unique funding mechanism that does not exist in any other context. And what it does is provide an opportunity to EPA to provide funds to the tribe to conduct research or work that will benefit EPA and make EPA's ability to do their work easier and more effective. The direct implementation tribal cooperative agreement, although it was for the benefit of all 5 tribes in Maine, the DITCA was awarded to the Aroostook Band of Micmacs to oversee and administer for the life of the project. And the specific activity that EPA was funding was to assist the tribes to, again, develop water-based exposure pathways to ensure that water quality criteria that are developed protect designated uses of the waters, which would be the tribal cultural uses. And for waters with multiple uses, such as tribal uses, according to the Clean Water Act, the water criteria needs to support the most sensitive use of the waters. So kind of getting to the purpose of our project, it's to document tribal cultural practice and resource utilization patterns of the tribes through the development of multi-pathway exposure scenarios to support the development of appropriate water quality standards that will protect tribal health, cultural practices, and also ensure that provisions of the Clean Water Act are being satisfied. We came up with a title for our project, and we called it Regaining Our Native American Cultural Heritage by Developing Native American Exposure Pathways. And we chose that title for our project because in Maine, sadly, and this is true, I guess, in most of the rest of the country, tribal resources over the years have either become contaminated by pollutants or have become diminished to a great extent because of tribal uses of those resources, and there haven't been adequate protection mechanisms in place. So we felt that by developing the exposure scenarios that EPA could use to ensure that provisions of the Clean Water Act are being satisfied, that would help strengthen tribal efforts to restore important resources. Before we actually began our project, we needed to sit down and kind of agree upon a process that we would follow throughout the course of the project. The first thing we did was we developed a work plan and budget and timeline for the project. And we took that to each of the respective tribal governments, and each tribe authorized a tribal council resolution formally endorsing their support for the project. Then we had identified a mechanism that we thought would work best, which would be hiring a tribal risk assessor and a tribal anthropologist to collect all of the relevant data and information from the literature and extract the data, and then go through the data with technical and cultural staff of each of the tribes and kind of ground truth the data and make sure that it was consistent with tribal beliefs and understanding of historic use of natural resources. We also had concerns about confidentiality and privacy, which I'll discuss in a moment. And then a first draft of the report was produced. We had an external review panel that we assembled of peer reviewers and technical experts. And that was followed by a final draft of the report, and then the tribal councils looked at the report, and once again they did a tribal resolution supporting the report, and then it was finalized and published. Three key characteristics of our approach that I think are real important that I wanted to mention. One of them, as I previously mentioned, is data confidentiality. We had a lot of concerns about privacy. In fact, for some of the information, especially as it was related to us by tribal cultural experts or tribal elders or tribal subsistence practitioners, involves their personal use of natural resources for medicinal purposes and spiritual purposes. So clearly there's privacy concerns there because of health and religious use of those resources. So we needed to make sure that that sort of information was protected. A second concern with regard to data confidentiality is that much of this information represents proprietary information for each of the tribes, and tribal cultural practices really are what distinguish one tribe from another, and it's inherent information for the tribe. So it's proprietary and confidential. That was another concern. Later on, as I discuss the exposure scenarios in a little more detail, you will see how we alleviated those concerns. Another real important characteristic of our approach is that we realized it needed to be legally defensible and scientifically sound. Definitely on the legally defensible side, because when Maine sought authorization to run the NPDES program in the state, there were a lot of comment letters that were submitted to EPA, and some of those comment letters actually came from industry supporting Maine's assertion to regulate waters within the state. And in the course of their support for the state, they kind of downplayed the tribal interest in natural resources. And like in any of the big industries out there, they have lots of money for lobbying and for lawyers. And if it's something that's going to prevent them from discharging waste or interfere with that, they are going to fight it with their lawyers. So whatever we do is going to be under a lot of scrutiny. And then from EPA's perspective, they are going to be using this information to make decisions on actions that Maine takes, because even though the state of Maine is now responsible for issuing the discharge permits and developing the water quality standards, EPA still has the ultimate authority for reviewing Maine's practices to make sure they're consistent with the Clean Water Act. So since EPA is going to use tribal information to make sure Maine is doing the right thing, they need to have something that satisfies their need for scientifically sound information. The final thing that I wanted to mention, and I have another slide on this also, is that we did not utilize consumption surveys. I remember a period of time, and I think this was in the early 2000s, that EPA was really encouraging tribes to conduct consumption surveys, to go out and survey their members and find out the level of resource use. And then either EPA or even the tribe, I guess, would use that information to make regulatory decisions and decide how clean is clean and set environmental standards. And that has had a lot of concerns for me and for some of the other tribes. And in Maine, one issue that we have that's really important is the issue of suppressed consumption. Everybody knows that our resources are contaminated. We have a statewide fish consumption advisory due to the presence of mercury. We have a number of other special advisories due to other contaminants. Our resource base has been severely diminished. In fact, some of the tribes are just now beginning to reestablish a land base. So I mentioned earlier the 285,000 acres number. That is still actually growing because the tribes were provided with some funding to acquire some land, and the tribes are still acquiring land as we speak. So because of the diminished resource base, the over-utilization of those resources by non-natives, the contaminant issues, people aren't using the resources like they want to and they've used historically. So just going out and surveying people to find out how much fish they're eating and then set rules to protect that level of consumption does not really get the tribes where they want to be, because each of the tribes has a real active environmental restoration program and natural resource program, and we're working very hard to restore the resources, make them plentiful again, and rid them of contamination. So we need standards that protect at a higher level of consumption than that is currently occurring. And there's also the issue that a consumption survey does not factor in other significant exposure factors, such as increased caloric intake when you're living an active lifestyle, increased rates of respiration, sediment ingestion, increased use of drinking water, and factors like that. So it doesn't really give a full picture of what the exposures are. I have a couple of slides that kind of illustrate the contrast between the process that EPA typically uses and one that's more consistent with tribal exposure pathways. This first slide really shows the typical way that EPA evaluates exposures and risks. And this is for a suburban lifestyle. It looks at food exposures and drinking water exposures, some incidental contact with the environment through like respiration and inhalation and dermal hazards, but it's pretty limited in scope. As I mentioned, if you're living a traditional life way, there's other exposures that aren't included in that sort of that typical model. There's exposures while gathering and harvesting and utilizing natural resources. There's increased contact with soils when harvesting plants and processing plants for different cultural activities. There's cultural activities that increase your exposure rates, such as basket making, sweat lodges, using and making different tools, culturally important tools. And again, the frequency and duration of activity and contact with the environment is increased. So in looking at that, again, from a model that's more consistent with tribal exposures, it shows the same typical exposures that EPA looks at, but it adds additional exposures for utilizing resources from various ecosystems, processing game and vegetation, cultural uses, and then, of course, the increased contact and through like drinking water consumption or use of surface water in a sweat lodge, and those sorts of activities. So that really gets us to the definition of what an exposure scenario is. It's really a set of activities and diets that describe a lifestyle and a degree of environmental contact. And if you know what the contaminant load is and the resources that are being utilized, then you can actually arrive at a risk assessment. The exposures themselves are, exposure factors themselves include the frequency, duration, intensity of contact for individual activities or a particular native diet. And if we were to look at a baseline scenario, that would describe how the resources are used if they are uncontaminated and plentiful and used at the rate that's desired. In our particular approach, it's a multi-pathway scenario because it looks at a combination of exposures that capture all of the pathways that I had previously mentioned. So what we were hoping to come up with and develop are actual numeric representations for the Maine tribes that depict traditional cultural lifeways in Maine based on diet and environmental contact. And we needed to make sure that this information was produced in a format that is typically used by EPA and other regulatory agencies during their development of environmental standards and evaluation of baseline environmental risks. One important question when developing exposure pathways like this, knowing that we've got some suppressed consumption going on, is kind of figure out what should be the temporal scope of the scenario. At what time should we be looking to represent? Oops, I just went by that slide. If we look just at the present, there's a real diminished use of the resources because of the contamination concerns and the lack of those resources. If we look to the past when resources were used at their highest levels, that really kind of gives us a glimpse of the future because we know there's tribal members in our community that it's their desire to practice a traditional lifestyle if the resources are there and they're uncontaminated. And it's definitely, at least for the Maine tribes, it's the desire of the tribes to encourage tribal members to go back to living a more traditional lifestyles, especially in terms of utilizing the resources, because we know that there's big health benefits to consuming the healthy traditional foods versus the processed foods that are now available. And then all the other tangible benefits, such as the cultural activities and the fitness and nutrition that comes along with practicing a traditional lifestyle. So for our particular project, we looked back through the historical records to determine, kind of when the right place and time is that would kind of demonstrate where the tribes would like to be in terms of resource utilization. The tribal scenarios or exposure factors themselves, they represent the intersection of three different areas. Obviously, the ecology tells us what's there in terms of natural resources, what's available, what's important culturally. The toxicology or risk assessment area tells us how people are exposed, what's in their diet, what's the frequency of contact and duration. And then the anthropology or ethnography actually describes the traditional lifeways and natural resource uses. In the state of Maine, the initial literature survey determined that there are three major ecocultural types. There's a coastal ecocultural type, an inland ecocultural type with an anadromous river, and that's the returning fish from a marine environment. And then there's an inland ecocultural type with resident fish and wetland areas. And that kind of forms a basis for three major diets that were developed for the exposure pathways. When describing the traditional lifeways of the tribes in Maine, there's a number of different areas that need to be considered or integrated into the process. As I mentioned, ecology is based on what natural resources are there, but also cultural use of the resources, dietary use of the resources, traditional ecological knowledge. We had data quality objectives that we are trying to achieve, again, so that EPA could use this information and it's scientifically sound. There's the physiological aspects in terms of living an active lifestyle. Ethnobotany kind of gives us clues to how some of the vegetation was utilized in the past, because that hasn't really been that well preserved at the anthropological or archaeological sites. Language and oral traditions tell us a lot about historical use of natural resources. So all these different components need to be considered when describing traditional lifeways. And looking at some of the examples of the exposure factors, there's some real stark differences between kind of a suburban exposure scenario and a traditional exposure scenario. In the case of drinking water, there could be much greater ingestion of drinking water due to the active lifestyle. Fish consumption is obviously higher for a traditional community because it's a real important source of protein. And looking at the duration of exposures or context to environmental media, and EPA's models, they use the 30-year mortgage, I guess, when you're attached to a piece of property, whereas for in a tribal context, it would be an entire lifetime and multiple generations. The frequency of exposure in a suburban scenario is limited or periodic, whereas in a tribal scenario, it's a constant 365 days a year. And then there's other factors that, like I mentioned earlier, aren't even considered in EPA's typical exposure scenario, such as cultural activities like sweat lodge use. But the net result is that a traditional lifestyle results in a 10 to 100 times more exposure than suburban lifestyles. In terms of the specific method that we used for this project for describing Wabanaki diets in Maine, and Wabanaki is a collective term to refer to all of the tribes in Maine, and actually there were several other tribes where there's no longer tribal members that represent those tribes, or they've been integrated into some of the existing tribes in Maine. But essentially going back and describing the ecology and natural resources, and this is from the literature and from historical accounts. Again, defining the major ecological types in Maine, examining the literature for detailed descriptions of natural resource use. And in Maine, I believe that dates to the early 1600s, is when kind of some of the first Europeans had contact with the tribes in Maine, and some of them kept detailed journals or made observations on how native peoples were utilizing the resources, identifying dietary staples and major food groups, confirming those with tribal staff, identifying representative members of each food group, then using that in conjunction with nutritional data from USDA on either those foods or similar foods, and ultimately developing kind of a picture of a nutritionally complete diet that is consistent with tribal knowledge, the ecology of what's there, and also with the historical accounts that are found in the literature. So what we came up with is essentially three bounding diets that represent the three major ecosystem types in Maine: an inland freshwater, non-adramous waters, inland adramous waters, and coastal areas. I think a lot of folks, or everyone agrees that in reality that there's probably some overlap between all three of those major ecosystem types. And in some cases, there's a pretty good sense that there was seasonal bounds or seasonal migration routes where the tribes in Maine had permanent settlements where important resources were located, but they also took advantage of other resources. So in some cases, there may be an average of 2 diets, where it may be, let's say, more towards the middle of all three. There are some commonalities between the 3 diets, and a good example of that is the vegetation, and this would be statewide. There's a number of fruits and berries and nuts, cattails, mushrooms, maple syrup, resources like that that were included in all diets. And then the variables are the amount of small and large game and fish that was consumed. For the inland non-adromatous waters, those diets were primarily focused on large and small game, and some of the representative species there, like the moose and the muskrat, beaver, bear, partridge, turkey. In the inland anadromous waters, that's composed of fish that are resident and also the marine species that migrate up the rivers. And then in coastal areas, the emphasis is on marine resources. So essentially, even though there's 3 kind of diets, a quarter of the calories of each of the diets are the same, and they represent the major food groups or food categories. And as I mentioned, the variable portion of the 3 diets are based on the 3 ecological settings and differ in the amount of the 3 major protein categories, whether it be resident fish, seasonal fish, or large and small game. So in the case of the inland anadromous ecosystem or diet, migrating fish make up the majority of the diet in terms of the protein source. In the inland freshwater diet, the primary source of protein is large and small game, and then in the coastal ecosystem, it's marine resources. The next few series of slides that I'm going to show the major food categories that were developed, and for the purposes of today's discussion, I don't think it's real important to focus on what the differences are between the 3. But just it gets to the point of these are the major food categories that were determined, and any real further level of detail when developing exposure scenarios is not really necessary. So this in fact becomes one of the ways that we alleviate the privacy and data confidentiality concerns, is that we've developed a generalized diet that shows the fraction of the diet from protein sources and the major categories of food groups. So it's really not necessary to go into more detail than that. There were also food wheels that were developed for each of the 3 diets, and these are real helpful for illustrating the caloric distribution of the foods and the quantity of foods that make up that diet. In the inland anadromous diet, you can see that anadromous and marine fish make up the majority of both the calories and the number of grams of food consumed per day. Similarly, there's food categories and I guess like a quasi-food pyramid that was developed that show the components of each of the other 2 respective diets. One thing that's kind of different about conducting an exposure scenario, or developing an exposure scenario when we're looking at tribal information, is that it's not possible to just go out and do a broad cross-sectional survey of the population. And that's what EPA does when it's developing risk assessments and exposure models, and that it uses a probabilistic approach and determines ranges of resource use. In a tribal scenario, it's not possible to do that. We need to use a more deterministic approach, and really these diets are a best case representation of how resources were consumed, and it's really more towards a central tendency. So through the course of developing the diets and exposure factors, multiple lines of evidence were utilized to strengthen the conclusions, and also make it easier for the peer reviewers to follow the information. And as I mentioned, it comes from multiple sources. There were some early observers that have entered detailed historical accounts of what they observed when they interacted with the tribes in Maine. Cultural interviews were conducted with tribal cultural experts and tribal technical staff. There were also discussions with ethnobotanists and historians to kind of ground check the information. It's based on Maine ecology in terms of what is there in terms of natural resources. There's a physical archaeology component, although in Maine, this one is kind of interesting because many of the physical archaeology items that you would tend to think that you would rely upon are not accessible in Maine, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that in the last 400 years or so, sea level has, well, actually, I shouldn't say in the last 400 years, the last 4,000 years really is what everybody tends to agree that for the last 4,000 years, the vegetation and wildlife landscape in Maine has not really changed that much. But a lot of the earlier sites are now under like 25 feet of water, because after the glaciers retreated, we had sea level rise, and it's obscured many of the important cultural sites. Then the inland sites that weren't affected by sea level rise are now the places where there are cities and developed areas. So the areas where we expect to find the archaeological items are no longer present. So, in Maine, at least, the literature is based on what we know, but the archaeological record is not really complete. Then there's ethnographic information. In Maine, many of the place names have Wabanaki names attached to them, and those are linguistic clues to areas where resources were harvested or utilized. The Micmac calendar, each of the month names corresponds to a natural resource. And there's seasonal rounds that have been depicted that show a traditional lifestyle of Wabanaki tribes. Finally, there's a foraging theory that also supports the diets that were developed. And I know, I guess foraging theory is not without some controversy, but essentially it's looking at the amount of calories expended for the amount of calories that are gained, and looking at energy usage. And there's always, I guess, a strive towards being efficient, getting the most caloric bang for the buck, so to speak. And that also, I guess, needs to make sense in developing the diets. So all of this information is integrated together to develop the diets and exposure factors, and in the end what we've ended up with are tribal exposure scenarios that are indicative of freshwater and marine natural resource utilization patterns, and they can be used by EPA to evaluate the effectiveness of water quality standards in protecting tribal cultural health and the use of natural resources by Maine's tribes. In addition to this information being very useful for EPA and other regulatory agencies to develop and approve water quality standards, this can also be used in a risk assessment context to determine risk to tribes or cultural communities that are utilizing the resources. And essentially how that works is the scenario information, which describes the exposure in terms of frequency, rate, and duration, is combined with the contaminant information that we know, and that enables us to determine the level of risk. If you use the scenario information and then risk criteria, like what is an acceptable level of risk, then you can kind of back calculate what the contaminant standards need to be. So if you're cleaning up a contaminated site, it can help answer that question, how clean is clean? Or in the case of water standards, what standard needs to be set to protect tribal usage of the resources? The full body of the report is actually posted on EPA's website. It was, again, done with EPA grant funds. It's been approved by all of the Maine tribes, so the report is available online. That's the address. If anybody wants me to email them a copy of the report, I'd also be happy to do that if you leave me your email address. And before I close out, I've just got to acknowledge the great work of the many people that were involved in this project. Barbara Harper is a tribal risk assessor. She's a member of the Umatilla Indian tribe and has many, many years of experience in performing tribal risk assessment work. In fact, it was quite a few years ago when I first started working for the Micmac tribe that I was really fortunate enough to attend one of her lectures, and I was very much intrigued by her approach, especially because around that same time, as I had mentioned, EPA was trying to encourage us to do the consumption survey, and I learned from Barbara that that's not really the best approach. Another individual that was extremely helpful and really helped to make the project a success is Darren Ranko. He's a member of the Penobscot Indian Tribe of Maine, and he was a professor at Dartmouth College, but he's now at the University of Maine, and he actually assisted with compiling all of the important pieces of literature that were collated and reviewed and used to come up with the diets and exposure factors. So he helped go through that process of reviewing all of the data. Then, like I mentioned, there were internal cultural and technical advisors. So these were like the tribal historic preservation officers or the cultural program directors, along with environmental staff that as the information was gathered, they helped ground truth the information. And finally, to me, really the thing that I think is really notable about this is the peer reviewer, our peer review team that we assembled to conduct the peer review of the draft report. And these folks are really leaders in their field. We had 2 tribal risk assessors. It was an EPA risk assessor, a risk assessor from academia. We had 2 toxicologists, 3 tribal cultural experts, a professor of indigenous human nutrition, an anthropologist, and an ecologist. Both of those folks are at the top of their field in Maine and in academia. So all of these folks came together, reviewed the draft report, submitted comments and suggestions back to Barbara and Darren, and those comments were incorporated into the final report. So I think we ended up with a really high quality product, and It's only been complete for, well, I guess we completed it in July of 2009, but I know the Penobscot Indian Tribe is actually already using this in some water quality standards discussions with the state of Maine. So I think it's going to be a really powerful tool and something that benefits the Maine tribes in a lot of different ways. My contact information is on the slide, and Valerie Bataille was my co-project manager representing EPA on this project. So I guess with that, I think we have a few minutes for questions. Yes.
Do you have like an approximation of how different the food pyramid looks now compared to 100, 1,000 years ago? Like how far off are they from getting back to subsistence living, as I assume that you said that they wanted to strive towards?
I think we're quite a ways off because, like in the case of the salmon, they're just simply not available, and there's a real economic issue. Even if the salmon, well, I guess if they naturally return to the rivers, they would be available again. But the resource has been so diminished that it's not available. But this diet really, I think, reflects the kind of the last 4,000 years, because there seems to be general agreement that the landscape in Maine has up until, say, the last 400 years was pretty constant for the last 4,000 years. So this is up to probably around the year 1600. Other questions? Comments?
So it kind of seems like tribes, not just in Maine, could use this too. Do you know if there are any other tribes that aren't in Maine?
There are. In fact, one that's not too far away is the Spokane Tribe of Indians in eastern Washington state. There was a paper that was published in a risk assessment journal that describes a multi-pathway exposure scenario that was developed by Barbara and some of her colleagues. And there's some other tribes that are also following this type of approach.
We'll look for you guys when we get to grad school.
So Fred, I have a question. How much do you think that the fish consumption messages and the advisories have impacted fish consumption? Do you think that has?
A great deal,
people are afraid.
In the Micmac community, I see both sides of the extreme. There are some folks that they're well aware of it and they know the threats, but they tell me it's their culture and it's who they are and it's kind of what defines them. So regardless of the health impacts, they are going to continue following a traditional lifestyle. I've also seen some young women actually have come to me and said they don't even allow their children to fish at all. They will not allow them to go fishing because they're so concerned about the contamination. So not only are they losing a real important component of their diet, all the cultural activities that go along with the fishing are being lost, the language and the cultural activities. So that it's not just the diet that's being lost, it has multiple impacts.
I want to mention a little bit about your fish farm project.
Yes, actually we have a couple of projects that are ongoing. We started out with a small community garden, and it's really to try and get some healthy food back onto the table, because in our area we're located in the far north, and produce just is not that plentiful, and a lot of our tribal community really did not have any place to even have a garden or grow their own produce, so that they've lost access to healthy foods like that. So we started a community garden as a way to get some of those foods back onto the table, and it's actually now evolved into a commercial farm for the tribe. So we're still distributing food out to the community, but we're also trying to generate some economic activity to support it. Similarly, with the fish, a number of years ago, actually I think it's about 5 years ago, we thought we would raise some fish in cages and some tribal ponds. So we would feed them and produce some fish, hopefully at a lower cost than what it would take to purchase those. But we had some pesticide impacts and runoff events, and it killed a large majority of our fish. So we got the idea of applying for some funds through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to build a tribal fish hatchery. And that's almost complete, or nearing completion. So we hope to be able to provide an affordable and clean source of fish for our tribal community to utilize. I know that that is not a good suggestion, and it really kind of bothers me that the real solution is to clean up the environment and make the fish safe to eat again, but there doesn't seem to be the political or willpower to make that happen. So we're kind of forced to improvise, and that means raising fish. So that's a project that's just getting started, and hopefully will provide some of that healthy protein back into the community.
How does Maine compare with like the rest of, say, the country and whatnot as far as contamination levels go?
Well, at least with mercury, we consider ourselves to be the tailpipe of the nation, and everything from the West Coast eastward ends up in Maine, because we're really at the tailwind of the entire country. So we're severely impacted by it. Even the most remote streams and ponds that are far removed from industry have problems with mercury. And Maine's not an industrial state by any means. We have, other than the paper companies, we don't have a lot of industry. Forestry and farming are the two main industries in Maine. But I don't know if we're worse than the rest of the country, because I attended some EPA-sponsored fish forums, and it seems like every state has a fish consumption advisory, so I think it's pretty widespread.
Is the push towards having a return to this more healthy living coming from the young people or the older people in the community, or both?
It's a combination of both, actually. For the Micmac tribe was not recognized by the 1980 Indian Claims Settlement Act. It wasn't until 1991. So for a long time, the Micmac community had really lost it. It had lost its land base, a lot of its resources, and federal recognition has really enabled the tribe to start developing its cultural programs, especially as some of the real acute needs start to be addressed, like health and housing and those sorts of issues. So there's a great deal of interest in the tribal community. And there is a very strong desire in the Micmac community to be able to practice their traditional lifestyle. And many of the tribal members will say they don't want to give up the comforts of life, but they want to practice ancient cultural activities and enjoy the foods of their ancestors. So there's a great deal of interest.
How much do the five tribes work together to sort of pool their political capital to move things forward beyond just this report? Are there any other examples of cooperative things?
I think there's more of that. That's something that the tribes are beginning to realize can be real effective when they speak together and work together. One of the things that's kind of hampered those efforts in the past is that the federal government has really made funding and things like that real competitive. So, in the past there's never been a good reason to work together, because every tribe was competing against each other in terms of real scarce grant dollars. But now I think, especially with some of these environmental issues, the tribes are realizing that they can be much more effective if they're working together. So, and fortunately, each of the the 5 Maine tribes have a long history of working together. I know there's other parts of the country where tribes, traditionally were adversaries, and so it's difficult to bring them together. But at least in the case of Maine, the tribes have a kind of a common historical background and have, the Wabanaki Confederacy that I mentioned is an ancient confederation of the Maine tribes, and it still exists today.